Welcome to the Live.Stock podcast, sponsored by the University of Tennessee Beef and Forage Center. I'm Bruno Pedreira, Center Director and Extension Forage Specialist, here today again in another podcast with Dr. Katie Mason, our beef cattle specialist. How are you doing, Dr. Mason?
Yeah, I'm great. Excited to be here to talk a little bit about trade and other things related to policy.
I think we'll have a different podcast today for you guys that have been with us. I'm very excited to have with us here today Dr. Muhammed, professor and Blasingame Chair of Excellence in Agricultural Policy at the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at our Institute of Agriculture here. So, Andrew, welcome to our podcast, man.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, we have been discussing that for a while. I'm glad that we were able to put you here with us today to learn a little bit more about you and learn about what you do in this trading market and all of this tension we have been having the last few months, I can say, right?
Yeah. So as we get started, just tell us a little bit about your position, how you got interested in this topic area, and what brought you here.
Yeah, no, I've been working on international trade issues for about 25 years now. Even my dissertation was on the World Trade Organization and its implications for U.S. dairy exports. And so I come at this just sort of both from academic training as well as just sort of research issues, and then even career-wise so I spent about 9 years with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Economic Research Service, where I worked on trade issues there. And in part sort of trade policy, like research to advise trade policy, and research to advise trade positions, sort of thinking about the competitiveness of U.S. products in global markets. And so I do research on a broad array of sectors. And one of those sectors that I've sort of focused on quite often is the beef sector. And in part, because one, is controversial in many trade agreements. And then two, when I first got introduced to global beef trade, it was related to what was then going to be a pretty big trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And obviously President Trump in 2016 rather, withdrew from it. But a big controversial thing there was could we get Japan to lower tariffs on U.S. beef? So that was sort of my introduction to global beef trade. And I've been writing a few papers on beef here and there ever since.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I got into the beef business because I like to grill on Friday.
Right. Well, I love it. It's good
I thought you were going to take that line.
No, it's good food too. I'll give you that.
Oh gosh. But Andrew, let's talk a little bit. And you already mentioned things. I would say that things changed in the last year or so, right? How do you see all of these tariffs and how do you think those would change the livestock industry in the US?
Right. You know what's interesting about the United States is that we're both a top global beef exporter. We may be sort of second or third in the world, and we're also a top global beef importer. We may be second or third in the world. So trade matters to our sector, both in terms of satisfying consumer demand as well as the profitability of our livestock producers in the United States. Now, here's what's interesting, though, is that of all the beef we produce in the U.S., only 10% gets exported. Maybe 12%. But that 12% makes beef like a top 5 agricultural export. Like it's up there. Usually it's in excess of about $10-12 billion. Now it's kind of dropped slightly below that. And that's mostly due to current trade tensions. And here's the point I'll make in terms of sort of what's been happening this last year. So clearly, President Trump is particularly interested in issues related to the trade deficit. He sees trade deficits sort of on a bilateral basis, and he sees them as problematic, right? That trade deficits in and of themselves, right, ipso facto, evidence of wrongdoing, right? That's how he sort of sees it. And clearly, the remedy for this is to put tariffs on countries around the world. We could probably talk about the Supreme Court ruling on this last Friday.
Yes.
But the problem is countries have retaliated, and they often retaliate against agriculture. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is a rise of China as a major buyer of U.S. beef.
Okay. Yeah.
Like going from negligible amounts, if not zero amounts, due to the BSE ban that lasted far longer than any other country that banned
Mhm.
U.S. beef. And then we saw this recovery in exports to China. One could say this emergence. And China became sort of one of our leading destinations, right up there with Japan and South Korea. And this year that's collapsed. Pretty much went down to zero. And a big part of that is not just the tariff retaliation, which was sort of minimal. China also simply didn't reinstate licenses for U.S. exporters,
It-
which is one would
which
consider a
impacts a lot. Yeah.
non-tariff barrier. And a big part of what that does is we're fortunate in the sense that we are at a period where we have tight cattle inventories. And so
Uh,
these kind of trade barriers that leave too much product on the market, we don't necessarily see price effects or downward pressure on prices that we would otherwise see, but we've certainly seen the loss in export sales. Yeah.
Yeah, so thinking about that and talking about markets and how this is relevant, I talk to my students about why we should think about global policy or global trade and how it impacts the beef business, and thinking about producers as well. We're a segmented industry. Sometimes it feels like what we do on a small farm, is not maybe directly impacted by those big things, or it doesn't feel like it when you go to sell those weaned calves at the local market. So why does the local producer need to be kind of in tune with what these bigger picture
Because
things are?
they probably can change anything anyway, right? They're
Right.
not going to be big players in the market. How
Yeah.
they can be into this?
Well, but clearly, this is one thing I always have to sort of say to farmers when I speak to them throughout the state, and that is, it does not matter if, say, your chicken or your cow or your soybeans or your particular bushel of corn is put on a barge and shipped overseas, you're still impacted by global phenomenon all the same,
Mm.
right? So the beef prices you face, even in the niche private market, is still influenced by global issues, right? So if there's a drought in Australia that causes a shortage of beef, that's going to lead to upward pressure on prices. The fact that you personally may not compete with Australian beef does not matter. It puts upward
Mhm.
pressure on all prices. And the way it works is this way. Um, so there are the big players directly impacted, right? And so let's say prices go up and it creates sort of this increase where this prices go up as a result of increase in demand, but this demand is in foreign markets. Well, that encourages us to sell more to those foreign markets.
Mhm.
But as a result, that leaves less product available domestically, which then puts upward prices on these kind of domestic markets. And so the point is, even if you find yourself in a domestic niche market, you're going to still be impacted by global pressure on prices. Now, what may or may not happen is sort of the amount that you sell, but certainly the value of what you receive is a function of what's going on globally.
Mhm.
Let's talk a little bit. You already mentioned the Supreme Court decision last
Yeah.
week as well, right? A few weeks ago, we got all of these tariffs that and we have been managing those tariffs. Sometimes they're higher, sometimes they're lower.
Right.
Sometimes we in a few cases we change them as we start to negotiate
Yeah,
with
right.
them. But now the Supreme Court came and said, no, it cannot be done like this, and we probably will have new decisions coming in the coming month.
Right.
Where are we at with this, and what do you think is coming?
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? I think the Supreme Court ruled that sort of the president's use of this International Emergency and Economic Powers Act, IEPA, and I may be getting emergencies versus economics sort of switched, but the so-called IEPA tariffs, or the use of that act as a means of imposing tariffs on
Hmm.
all countries and in all products at any time without approval, they see that the Supreme Court said it's not constitutional.
Okay.
And obviously, the Constitution says tariffs in trade and commerce is in the hands of Congress. So it doesn't stop the president from imposing tariffs. It just requires that he gets congressional approval to do it, and Congress votes and approves it. And so what that has done is completely eliminated the tariffs that were introduced in April, the
Okay.
so-called Liberation Day tariffs. But President Trump has been quite effective at using sort of these off the shelf kind of trade policies that no one's thought about. Right. So Section 232 of the Trade Act, I think of 1964 or something like that. That's the national security one, but there you have to initiate an investigation. There's also an Unfair Trade Practices Act. I think it's Section 301 of the Trade Act. There you also have to initiate an investigation. And so he's been quite effective at doing that. And then once commerce rules say in the favor of the aggrieved party, in this case, it would be the United States, then it allows the president to impose tariffs. So the Supreme Court has not sort of invalidated that. And then there's this new act that apparently I didn't even know about, Section 122, if I'm not mistaken. And that one is sort of a balance of payment issue where that allows the president to, apparently, according to sort of how I've read it and what he's also said, to impose 15% tariffs across the board, but for 150 days, unless Congress approves its extension. So here's the point that I am not quite sure we're out of this period of uncertainty. I'm not quite sure. And more important than the tariffs is sort of the erratic, chaotic nature of their implementation, their implementation, then removal, their delay, then implementation. Then if a country comes to the table, their abolishment on this product, but not others. And what all of this uncertainty does is it causes investors to just park their money on the sideline. And so, for example, you can imagine, let's say if you are a beef processing facility and you want to expand capacity in Mexico, or you want to expand capacity in the United States, well, the tariffs are meant to encourage domestic investment, but you don't know if the tariffs are temporary or not.
Okay, yeah.
But you need tariffs to be permanent if you're going to make a domestic investment.
So you make it long term.
Yeah, you need, exactly. Because the whole purpose of a tariff is to make domestic investments much more competitive, or domestic production more competitive. But then you're not going down to Mexico either, because you don't know if the tariffs are permanent, right? If they're permanent, then you're in a permanently non-competitive position by being outside of the United States. And so what you do is you sort of wait for things to calm down. And I think that's the downside of all of this. It's sort of the uncertainty of it. And we do really need to get back to some type of permanence when it comes to U.S. trade policy.
And probably if the Supreme Court decision as well, will take a little bit longer to make decisions from now on, right? Because it's not just Mr. Trump making a decision. It needs to go through Congress, and there'll be a process behind that.
Exactly. But I don't know if he wants to use Congress. He's going to probably try to stick with these off-the-shelf trade acts and investigations. And I'm assuming in the next 150 days, he's going to probably use that time period sort of to figure out how to keep things going. Right.
One thing that I'm thinking about as you're talking about these, looking forward, decisions being made at the production level, right? I think about how can I help the producer on the ground today with management decisions in light of all of this. So, we talk about the beef business being the long game. You're making a decision that's going to be, for several years out. So, you may not focus as much on the production side, but what kind of advice do you have for, staying the course in the beef industry as a whole, I guess, as this happens?
Well, unlike a lot of agricultural sectors right now, one could argue, man, the beef industry is doing quite well economically, right? That we have depressed commodity prices, which technically means depressed feed costs. And here we have these really high beef prices, both. And we
also have the lowest herd in
that's
5 years.
That's the whole point, right? That it does sort of say we're in this period of reinvesting and expanding capacity, and this sort of represents the beginning of it. And the economics are there to encourage it, right? One would argue high prices are the cure for high prices. It's that these high prices encourage this increased investment. What would be tough is a situation where we were at record low inventory levels and prices were low.
Sure.
such that it would cause inventory levels to fall even more so. Like perfect example would be like, say, cotton acreage in West Tennessee.
Mhm.
That's down significantly, but it's going to continue to go down because prices are too low to encourage
Does not justify.
increase investments moving forward. So at least we're in a situation to where there's incentive to increase the cattle inventory
Yeah.
through high prices. Whether or not that happens, I don't know, and I don't really get too down in the weeds on production issues, but I do know at least that prices tend to encourage investment. And what the downsides, I think, what's taking place is clearly disease issues in Mexico, because we did import a lot of live cattle. And that may be part of the problem, that disease issues are sort of limiting the live cattle we import, which could help to rebuild herd populations. But that said, the economics at least says that there is a return on investment when increasing herd size.
Okay. I think one of the things that we haven't talked yet today, Andrew, is we talk a little bit about the agriculture trade deficit, right? And I think the tariff is in all of these tensions also trying to change that scenario. One of the questions I have for you is, what exactly are we importing, and are we importing things that we don't produce here? How do you see this agricultural trade deficit today, and is this the best way to solve the problem?
Yeah, I'm always concerned when sort of trade deficits are used as a means of simply saying something is wrong. And that's regardless of how they're being defined. And so even if we take, say, the overall trade deficit, and if you don't mind, I'm going to sort of take this piecemeal here, and I'll try to be quick, I promise.
No, let's do it.
Good.
All right, so you have the broader trade deficit. Strangely enough, when you hear about that on the news, a lot of that is about sort of tangible goods. We actually have a trade surplus when it comes to services. We sell more services to the world than we buy. Now, mind you, when a person hops on a plane and goes to Orlando and spends $500 to get his family in Disney World, that contributes to our surplus in services, because technically Disney World has just sold a service to a foreign national. So what the president clearly isn't thinking about that. And the real question is why. And so, but then to take it even further, still the president is thinking about issues of, well, not just the trade deficit, but we have a trade deficit with China and a trade deficit with Mexico. So now that even heightens the language here. Now we're sort of thinking about not just how to fix the deficit, but how do you fix a deficit with China?
With such a country.
Not to say it's even possible to fix it that way, but at least politically, that's the language. And then, so what it does is then it allows sort of politicians in this administration and appointees to then take that narrative all the way down to agriculture and to say, how do we solve the agricultural trade deficit problem? And one of the things I think what's important here is clearly we had this long period when we exported far more agriculture than we imported. Both were growing at significant rates, both imports and exports. It just so happens one was higher than the other, but both were growing.
Which is good and what we want, right?
Exactly. And imports continued to grow. And then over the last 3 or 4 years, exports started to collapse, right? That's what we've seen. Now, when you drill down into the data, the first thing you're going to notice on the export side is the majority of that decline in export sales to China. No place else. It's like that is a trade war phenomenon. And I find it interesting that we don't want to face that reality, that is a trade war phenomenon that inspired China to say, we're going to invest in Brazil. We're going to import more beef from Brazil, more corn and cotton from Brazil, more
beef,
more soybeans. But obviously, Brazil is now China's largest supplier of beef, right? And so that's that. And then, but what people sort of leave out of that conversation, which I find strange, so they completely ignore this is a one country phenomenon that's caused that collapse in exports. The second thing they seem to ignore, which I find strange, is what are we actually importing? Even in the case of beef, we're importing beef that we need. We import around the same amount that we export, but we're not importing competition. We're
A
importing something
different
to
product.
satisfy
Right.
our hamburger demand. It's something we could not do without sacrificing, right? The
Mhm.
sales of high value primals to the world,
Mhm.
right? So this is sort of a symbiotic relationship where we need those exports in order to satisfy our demand while at the same time sort of maximize profits from export sales for things beyond what we're consuming. And then the last thing I'll kind of say is then if we dig even deeper still to make it even broader, we're pretty much importing what we can't produce. Fresh fruits and vegetables,
Mhm.
coffee, and we're also importing something that we seem to can't get enough of, and that's beer, wine, and spirits. And people often forget beer, wine, and spirits are considered agricultural products.
Okay.
They're counted among agricultural trade. And for whatever reason, we have about a 30 to 40 sort of billion-dollar agricultural trade deficit, and two-thirds of that is beer, wine, and spirits. We like scotch.
So we are talking about Scotch,
Yeah,
French wine, and
exactly.
Mexican beer.
Yeah. Oh man, you'd be shocked. We like scotch. We love Irish whiskey. We love Canadian whiskey. Now, mind you, we're here in Tennessee, and let me just say to the camera in the audience, a true Tennessee whiskey, Kentucky bourbon fan
Two
here.
here.
So I am not part of the problem. But there are a whole lot of people here who love single malt
Yeah.
scotch and other things, and
Oh, but
we don't
that's
produce it. And tequila can only be produced in Mexico. $6 billion. So you can imagine we could ban tequila and knock out a chunk of that deficit
yeah.
right away. But you'd be hard pressed to prove to me that when you go to a bar, when you go to a bar, I go to a bar and buy tequila, that I've somehow enriched Mexican agave farmers at the expense of U.S. agricultural producers.
Yeah. No, this is interesting because I didn't know that all of these spirits, wine and beer were, accounted for within our agricultural trade
Right.
deficit as well. Man, I think we had a great conversation here.
Yeah,
Dr.
no, it's
Mato, do you
been
have
good.
something else that you want to add on this?
No, I think it's great. I think it's just good to get kind of that bigger picture and put things into perspective about why all of
Bring
these
light
things
to the
matter.
discussion.
And yeah.
Yeah. Well, Andrew, as a final word, how do you see the next few months or years? I don't know if
Man,
you can.
oh
We all
man.
know they don't have a crystal ball, but what do you see coming?
Well, I think the Supreme Court decision was at least a step in the right direction for stability. I know how the president feels about the ruling, but in terms of more stable trade policy, it was a step in the right direction. I do think we need to actually think about trade agreements in that official way that trade agreements once got negotiated in terms of with congressional approval, permanence through law. Because right now, what we have are these kind of executive order economic frameworks. And if you notice, as soon as the Supreme Court ruled against the IEEPA tariffs, it was already talked that some of these countries would not honor these handshake deals. But trade agreements get codified into law, and it does not matter
You're
who
gonna
leaves office and what
be.
rules it's permanent. And we do need to get back to that. And I also think we need to get back to sort of multilateral organizations. They serve a purpose. Like we're never going to, for example, solve the ban on hormone treated beef in Europe
Right.
on our own, right? We really do need international bodies to sell this story that hormone treated beef is just as safe as hormone free beef. Whether or not someone in the audience believes that, I'm just saying,
Yeah.
just according to the actual science, like if that's what we want to push, we really do need international bodies. So I think we need to get back to sort of multilateralism to at least sort of complement these kind of bilateral approaches
Right.
to solving trade problems and trade issues.
Andrew, it's been a real pleasure to have
Oh no,
you
it's
here.
been good. It's been real good.
I think that's the kind of conversation we want to have here in the
Mhm.
Live.Stock podcast and share with our Tennessee producer.
Yeah.
Now, where we are at and what can we do with whatever information we have right
Oh,
now.
sounds good. All right.
Thank you so much for taking your time to come
Oh,
here.
thank you.
I hope to see you all in the next Live.Stock podcast with some beef or forage related discussion here. Thank you all so much.